Initially, it seemed that victory would be decided on the battlefields. However, within the first months of the 1939 invasion of Poland, and especially after Germany's attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, it became clear war is not just about soldiers in trenches and tanks at dawn, but also about factories, ore, metal, and labor. It was in industry, and not solely on the front lines, that the reasons were laid for Germany's loss of the ability to translate its combat successes into long-term strategic gains. By the mid-1940s, the German leadership was forced to admit that battlefield superiority was increasingly being offset by either an inability to sustain production long-term or the impossibility of scaling it up. Intelligence services and reports stored in archives, particularly in the Bundesarchive and in captured documents at the U.S. National Archives, paint a clear picture. When Germany launched the war, its arms industry had already entered a strategic dead end. The increasing complexity of weapons, growing demands for skilled labor, raw material logistics, and then the destruction from air raids, all of this gradually deprived the industry of its operational flexibility. Having begun with conquests and blitzkrieg operations, Germany conducted military operations significantly more successfully than many countries of comparable size. But by the period of 1943-44, it became clear the front could be won in the short term, but the war is won when the entire economic and production base is engaged. And here Germany found itself at a disadvantage. One of the primary reasons was that the leadership of the Wehrmacht and the Reich underestimated the problem of mass production, both in terms of volume and stability. The production of tanks, aircraft, and artillery required not just individual workshops, but a large-scale industry capable of operating in a continuous supply mode. For example, the company Altmärkische Kettenwerke in Berlin-Borsigwalde, which produced assault guns and tanks, delivered 255 Stug 3 assault self-propelled guns in October 1943, but only 24 units by December of the same year. The reason was a chain of air raids, destruction of warehouses, disruptions in the supply of steel and components, as well as the need to relocate and modernize production. The escalation of production problems was accompanied by an increasing reliance on labor, including forced labor. For example, the large German company Hugo Schneider AG expanded its factories during the war to dozens of sites, including plants in occupied Poland, where tens of thousands of forced laborers from concentration camps were used. This is not just a moral problem, it reflects the fact that Germany lacked a voluntary skilled workforce, which ultimately reduced the quality and volume of production. So what do the figures and archival reports reveal? According to data accumulated in a survey of German industry, by 1943, the growth rate of arms production had already slowed down significantly compared to initial expectations. For example, the charts show that the production of combat aircraft in Germany reached peak values in 1944, but at the same time, Allied air raids and disruptions in the supply of raw materials began to reduce the efficiency and stability of production. Analyzing the course of events, we can outline a series of interconnected stages. The first stage, a rapid buildup of armaments in preparation for the war in 1938-39. The second, the exploitation of industrial potential during the initial operations. The third, the entry into a production crisis. And the fourth, when the front began to demand more and more resources while industry could no longer meet them. In the early 1930s, when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power, Germany began a large-scale rearmament program. However, its industry was far from ready for full mobilization, a lack of sufficient raw material reserves, an insufficient educational and professional level of the workforce, and outdated infrastructure. Nevertheless, thanks to aggressive policies, state investments, and the exploitation of occupied territories, Germany significantly increased the production of weapons, cannons, light tanks, and aircraft. Archives show that by the beginning of the war, Germany was able to produce millions of rifles, hundreds of thousands of submachine guns and machine guns. However, at a critical juncture, as the war expanded in the east and the front demanded ever more resources, Germany faced a situation where its factories could not bridge the gap between combat needs and the ability to meet them. Air raids, bombings, the release of resources by the USSR and the USA, and the expansion of front lines, all of this demanded from Germany not just an increase in equipment production, but also sustainable logistics, repair, and modernization. And here a weak element emerged. The installation of production for new types of equipment, such as jet aircraft and new guns, required time and resources that the front could not provide. In the presented archival material from document group T321, a series of aviation and armament production statements, it is evident that the production of aircraft engines and aircraft for the Luftwaffe was growing, but the growth rate could not compensate for losses and defeats on the front. From this it follows that even if the frontline forces had been at a high level, without industrial support they were doomed to exhaustion. This is precisely why it can be argued that Germany lost not so much due to the weakness of soldiers in the trenches, but rather due to the limitations of its industrial base, factories, raw materials, labor, reserves, and logistics. After 1941, when the Wehrmacht entered the borders of the Soviet Union, German industry faced systemic strain for the first time, which it had not known before. According to reports from the Reich Ministry of Armaments, particularly documents from the Rüstungsamt Department, by the autumn of 1941, German factories were operating at over 130% overload compared to the pre-war level. At first glance, this appeared to be a sign of mobilization power. However, a different meaning lay behind these figures. Equipment was wearing out without replacement. Skilled technicians were going to the front, being replaced by unskilled workers and foreign prisoners of war. From the summaries of the Industrial Department of the OKW, it is known that the average labor productivity in machine-building enterprises in 1942 was 83% of the 1939 level, despite an almost 25% increase in the number of workers. This meant that each new unit of labor produced less output than before, and this could not be compensated for by sheer numbers. Under these conditions, Germany began to utilize forced labor on an unprecedented scale. According to data from the German Federal Archives and the Nuremberg documents, series PS2220, by 1944, approximately 7.6 million foreign workers and prisoners of war were employed in the industry of the Third Reich. They constituted up to 30% of the entire workforce in arms production. However, the efficiency of this labor was extremely low. Lack of training, sabotage, illness, and insufficient nutrition reduced the quality of manufactured products. In a report dated October 6, 1943, the Plenipotentiary for Labor, Fritz Sockel, reported to Göring that the defect rate in the production of ammunition carried out by foreigners exceeds the German rate threefold. This directly affected the Army's combat readiness because mass defects necessitated spending resources on repairs and checks, slowing down the entire production cycle. By mid-1942, the Ministry of Armaments, led by Fritz Todt, realized that the key problem was not the number of factories, but the lack of centralized control over production processes. The German economy remained fragmented among various departments. Hitler encouraged competition between these structures, believing it would stimulate efficiency. But in practice, departmental fragmentation destroyed coordination. The ministries of aviation, armaments, transport, and even propaganda had their own production programs that often overlapped and duplicated each other. As early as January 1942, Todt had prepared a memorandum stating, "The existing system makes it impossible to rationally use resources." A month later, on February 8th, he died in a plane crash, and Albert Speer took his place. Speer proved to be one of the few officials who understood the importance of industrial discipline and statistical control. He immediately set about reforming the system. Already in the spring of 1942, he eliminated several parallel bodies and created so-called armaments rings, industry commissions that united manufacturers of similar products. These measures indeed temporarily boosted arms production. Archival tables show that tank production increased from 4,900 units in 1941 to 12,000 units in 1943, and fighter aircraft production nearly tripled. However, this growth was superficial. It was achieved through labor intensification rather than an expansion of the raw material base. Metallurgy was already working at its limit, and supplies of iron ore and nickel from Finland began to decline under the blows of Allied fleets. The supply problem was particularly acute. According to reports from the Ost economic staff, industrial equipment captured in the East often could not be used due to a lack of power grids, destroyed infrastructure, and fuel shortages. In August 1942, General Thomas, who headed the economic department at the OKW, High Command of the Armed Forces, sent a report to Berlin in which he directly stated, "Raw material flows from the East cannot compensate for losses from the reduction of sea imports." This meant that Germany was gradually turning into an economically closed system, incapable of sustaining itself in the long term. Allied bombing added another destructive factor to this. In 1943, Anglo-American aviation began the systematic destruction of the Reich's industrial infrastructure. The point-blank campaign, later the Big Week, targeted factories producing aircraft, engines, and synthetic fuel. According to reports from the British Bomber Command, over 45,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Germany in July 1943 alone, disabling approximately 40% of aviation production capacity. Speer wrote in his memoirs, "After Hamburg, I realized that the industrial war was lost. We could no longer guarantee the continuity of production." Despite the destruction, Germany attempted to compensate for losses by decentralizing production. Factories began to be relocated into mines, tunnels, and caves. The Untertageverlagerung project became a symbol of the desperate attempt to hide industry from bombing. In Niedersachsen, Nordhausen, and Mittelwerk, where V-2 rockets were assembled, tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners were used. Reports from the Allied occupation forces after the war, NARA RG-260 series, noted that labor productivity in these underground facilities was only 56% of that of open-air factories, and worker losses reached up to 30% per month due to unsanitary conditions and exhaustion. All of this led to a paradox. Despite the apparent increase in overall production figures, real effectiveness was declining. For example, in 1944, Germany produced approximately 19,000 aircraft, but due to a shortage of pilots, fuel, and spare parts, no more than 11,000 were actually deployed in combat. Tank production reached around 18,000, but the front lines received only 13,000–14,000. The rest remained in storage or never arrived due to transport disruptions. According to reports from the General Courtmeisterstab, Heereswaffenamt, Series HWA 421, by December 1944, 38% of all tanks in units on the Eastern Front were immobilized due to a lack of parts. The industrial catastrophe that unfolded by the end of 1944 was systemic. Even with a high level of technical innovation, from Me-262 jet aircraft to V-2 ballistic missiles, Germany failed to translate technological advances into a quantitative advantage. This was due to the breakdown of cooperation between suppliers and the absence of stable production channels. Each new type of equipment required unique components, often manufactured in single factories, which were among the first to be destroyed in air raids. By 1945, German factories could no longer fulfill even half of their planned targets. In April of that year, Speer wrote to Hitler, "The existence of industry as a unitary organism has ceased to exist," and indeed, this is what determined the outcome of the war.
When it is said that Germany lost the war in its factories, the issue of fuel becomes the most striking example of this. Without fuel, tanks did not move, aircraft did not fly, and fronts were not supplied. As early as 1941, Germany realized that its own oil reserves were insufficient for even 1 year of full-scale combat operations. The main sources, the Romanian fields in Ploiești, limited reserves of synthetic fuel from coal, and partial purchases through neutral countries could not satisfy the growing needs of the Wehrmacht. Reports from the Reich Ministry of Economics in October 1941 indicate that daily fuel consumption for operations on the Eastern Front was around 23,000 tons, while the total processing capacity of Germany's synthetic plants, Löhne, Scholven, Blechhomer, did not exceed 14,000 tons per day. Germany was forced to rely on the synthetic industry, established during the Weimar Republic based on the Fischer-Tropsch process. However, the production of synthetic fuel required colossal amounts of electricity, hydrogen, and catalysts, copper, nickel, iron, which were already in short supply. Archival documents from the IG Farben conglomerate show that the cost of producing 1 ton of synthetic gasoline in 1942 was about 250 Reichsmarks, while a ton of Romanian oil cost only 90. Furthermore, according to the conglomerate's reports, the defect rate in synthetic production was up to 15%, and after the first bombings in 1943, it rose to 30%. Allied intelligence perfectly understood the vulnerability of this sector. In May 1944, Operation Oil Campaign began, the systematic destruction of oil refineries and synthetic plants. Strikes against Blechhammer, Löhne, and Braunschweig effectively paralyzed fuel production. According to a U.S. War Department report from November 1944, between May and September, Germany lost 80% of its synthetic gasoline production capacity. Albert Speer later recalled, "When the factories fell silent, the tanks stopped." This was no exaggeration. In September of the same year, Army reports recorded that motorized units on the Eastern Front were receiving only 40% of their required fuel volume, and some tank divisions were forced to abandon their equipment during retreats due to the inability to refuel them. The fuel problem also exacerbated the transport crisis. The German railway network was vital for supplying the army, especially after the failure of the Blitzkrieg in the Soviet Union, when the front line stretched for thousands of kilometers. According to data from the Reich Ministry of Transport, by mid-1943, almost 40% of rolling stock was in need of repair. Bombing of communication hubs, bridges, and depots disrupted the transportation system. A report from the Eastern Front Command in January 1944 noted that transporting one division from Germany to Smolensk took 14 days, whereas in 1941 it took only 5. In some cases, ammunition and food simply did not arrive. Trains stood on sidings for weeks due to a lack of fuel for locomotives. The Allies chose the right strategy, to destroy Germany's ability to move. From late 1944, air raids on bridges over the Rhine, Elbe, and Weser completely paralyzed logistics. Coal deliveries from the Ruhr to the central regions of the Reich were halved, and even factories that formerly retained their equipment could not operate due to energy shortages. Reports from Speer's ministry in December 1944 recorded steel production decreased from 2.6 million tons in June to 1.1 million by December. Electricity was supplied intermittently, and coal was mined at only 60% of planned levels. Alongside this, an energy catastrophe was escalating. Germany depended on coal, and every disruption in its transportation affected all industries. By January 1945, the largest power plants in Oberhausen, Dortmund, and Bochum were operating in emergency mode. These plants supplied not only factories but also underground weapons production facilities, where ventilation and lighting required constant power. When electricity began to be cut off, V2 production at Mittelwerk decreased by 70%. By the end of 1944, the situation in industry had taken on the character of a chain reaction. Reduced coal mining led to a decrease in electricity production, which in turn caused a slump in synthetic fuel, and this in turn hampered transport and supply, making it impossible to deliver coal. Documents from the Reich Bank in February 1945 provided a report. The production system has lost its self-sustaining character. The disruption of one link destroys the entire chain. German economists and engineers analyzed this collapse from a systems perspective after the war. According to the study Statistical Darstellung des deutschen Kriegswirtschaft 1939 to 1945, the economic power of the Reich reached its peak in August 1944, but within 3 months the industrial index had fallen by 38%. This collapse was unprecedented in any warring nation. For comparison, U.S. industry increased its output of war production by 15% during the same period, and the SSR by 8%. The difference between the countries lay not only in resources, but also in the structure of production organization. The U.S. and the USSR established centralized management systems, the War Production Board and Gosplan, which allowed for the optimal allocation of raw materials and labor. However, in Germany, competition between departments persisted until the very end. Even in 1944, Henschel was producing Tigers, Porsche was developing its own models, and Krupp was engaged in separate artillery projects without overall standardization and unification. This led to a dissipation of resources. Thus, Germany's defeat was not so much military as industrial. The loss of production manageability, the destruction of the energy and transportation systems, dependence on synthetic fuel, and constant bombings made it impossible to continue the war. Even if the fronts had held for a few more months, the factories would no longer have been able to supply them.
Krupp, one of Germany's oldest and most powerful industrial conglomerates, became a mirror of the Reich's entire war economy. Its history during World War II allows us to see how an industrial system with colossal potential gradually disintegrated under the influence of internal contradictions and external blows. As early as 1940, Krupp's factories in Essen, Magdeburg, and Bochum were producing up to 40% of Germany's artillery, armor plating, and heavy guns. Archival documents of the conglomerate, now held in the Ruhr Museum and partially in the U.S. National Archives, RG 260, show that by 1941, production capacity had nearly doubled compared to pre-war levels. But behind this outward success lay growing disorganization. From mid-1942, when constant Allied air raids began, Essen became one of the most heavily bombed locations in Germany. In 1943 alone, over 37,000 tons of bombs were dropped on it. The production of guns and armor declined month after month. A report from the director of the Krupp plant, dated December 11, 1943, preserved in the archives, stated, "Destruction in workshops number 3 and number 7 precludes further manufacture of large caliber barrels. Power supply has only been partially restored. Workers are forced to sleep in basements." Attempts to relocate production to subsidiary enterprises in Austria and Czechoslovakia did not yield the desired effect. Transportation could not cope, and the new sites lacked sufficient capacity. The Henschel Company in Kassel, responsible for the production of the Tiger and Tiger II tanks, demonstrates another facet of the problem: technological overload and a lack of standardization. The production of heavy tanks required precision machining, rare earth metals, and highly skilled personnel. Factory reports from July 1944 indicate that the manufacture of one Tiger took on average 300,000 man-hours, whereas the Soviet T-34 required around 25,000 and the American Sherman about 28,000. German quality was high, but the war economy demanded quantity, not perfection. By the autumn of 1944, the Kassel factories were producing no more than 35 tanks per month against plans of 120. The bombing of Kassel in October 1943 almost wiped the enterprise off the face of the earth. Photographs taken by Allied intelligence, now housed in the Imperial War Museums, show that vast assembly halls reduced to ruins, machine tools buried under rubble. Despite the desperate efforts of engineers, production could not be restored. Already in 1944, about a third of the total Tigers ordered were not delivered to the Army. Speer's memoirs record, Henschel requests materials that are not available in the Reich. His engineers propose new improvements, but each improvement adds another month to production. Thus, brilliant engineering thought turned into a strategic loss. Another giant, Daimler-Benz, supplied engines for aircraft and tanks. Its DB605 engine powered the famous Bf-109 fighters. But it was the aviation industry that suffered most from the bombings. As early as the summer of 1943, the Allies launched a series of pinpoint strikes on factories in Marienfelde, Günzburg, and Stuttgart. As a result, engine production fell by 60%. An archival report from the Ministry of Armaments dated August 14, 1944, states, out of 3,700 planned engines, only 1,570 are ready for delivery. Production is entirely dependent on the restoration of power supply. Messerschmitt's industry, concentrated in Augsburg, Regensburg, and Oberpfaffenhofen, clearly demonstrates what Speer called a catastrophe due to the dispersion of production chains. After the raids of 1943, aircraft assembly was divided among dozens of small workshops, many of which were located in mines and tunnels. This saved them from air attacks, but destroyed coordination. In the memoirs of engineer Ludwig Bohm from Messerschmitt, there is an entry from November 1944. We no longer know where our aircraft is being assembled. The wings are made in Tyrol, the fuselage under Salzburg, the engine in Berlin, and then everything waits for transport for weeks. The loss of time turned technological successes into meaningless records. In late 1944, the Reich made a final attempt to stabilize production, the so-called Totale Kriegsproduktion, or Total War Production Program. It was initiated by Speer with the support of Goebbels and Bormann. The goal was to reallocate all labor resources to the benefit of the war industry. Men and women, as well as adolescents, were mobilized from schools, theaters, and institutions. However, the effect was minimal. A memorandum from the Ministry of Labor in February 1945 noted, even if we increased the number of workers by 20%, we would not be able to launch production. Materials, energy, and transport are lacking. By this time, German industry had begun to resemble an organism afflicted with multiple organ failure. Each of its organs, metallurgy, mechanical engineering, chemistry, transport, was functioning only partially. Metallurgic plants in the Ruhr, hit by air raids, could not supply steel. The chemical industry, deprived of catalysts, did not produce fuel. Machine-building enterprises, cut off from energy, could not assemble equipment. The structure, once flexible and powerful, had finally collapsed. It was in these months that the dependence of military might on economic organization became evident. The Wehrmacht still had thousands of experienced soldiers and officers, and engineers had projects for jet aircraft, new submarines, and long-range guns at their disposal. But it was impossible to implement them. Copper, aluminum, magnesium, gunpowder, rubber, all of which fueled the war machine, were missing. Industry ceased to be the rear of the front. It had become its victim. Following Germany's surrender in May 1945, the Allies began a systematic survey of German enterprises. The reports of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey revealed astonishing figures. As a result of air raids and supply disruptions, the Reich's industrial capacity had decreased by 88% from its pre-war level. Of the 75 major tank and aircraft industry plants, 69 were completely destroyed or captured. Out of more than 10 million industrial workers, 6 million found themselves unemployed. This conclusion became one of the key arguments for post-war economic historians. Germany lost not so much on the front lines as in the factories. Its defeat was predetermined by the mismatch between the scale of the war and the capabilities of its economy. The industrial system, built on principles of competition and centralized authoritarian control, could not withstand the test of total war.
After 1945, Allied commissions began a systematic study of how the German war economy functioned. This was not only an attempt to assess the destruction, but also a desire to understand why a country with such a high level of industrialization, technical culture, and engineering achievements suffered a complete defeat. The reports of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey stated directly, Germany did not lose because of a lack of courage or will to resist, but because of the inability to maintain the resilience of its industrial system under the strain of total war. According to this study, the Reich's total industrial production in January 1945 was only 23% of the July 1944 level, and arms production had fallen by 75%. These conclusions were based on a vast array of data: 18,000 interviews with industrialists, engineers, and officials, 300,000 pages of documents, and hundreds of photographs of destruction. U.S. and British economists concluded that three factors played a decisive role: energy collapse, logistical paralysis, and organizational fragmentation of management. It was particularly emphasized that even without aerial destruction, the German system would not have withstood long-term mobilization. The gap between centralized control and actual local production capabilities was too great. The British part of the commission, led by economist John Woodruff, recorded detailed figures by industry. For example, steel production in Germany decreased from 31.8 million tons in 1939 to 17 million in 1944 and 5.5 million in 1945. Aluminum output fell from 240,000 tons to 60,000. Copper from 240,000 to 45,000 tons. Synthetic fuel, which provided nearly 90% of aviation gasoline, decreased from approximately 5.7 million tons in 1943 to less than 1 million in 1945. These figures were not just statistics. They meant that tank divisions received 60 to 70% less fuel than required, and hundreds of aircraft in the Luftwaffe were grounded every week. The French Commission, involved in the occupation administration, compiled a separate report on the state of the Ruhr's enterprises. A document from October 1945 noted, "Of the 40 blast furnaces, not a single one is functioning. Electricity supply has been reduced to 10% of the requirement. Production buildings are 80% damaged." At the same time, Krupp and Thyssen engineers involved in the surveys emphasized that the catastrophe began long before the final destruction. As early as 1943, factories could not fulfill orders due to a shortage of skilled workers and began working 12-hour shifts without days off, leading to widespread equipment failures. The Allies did not just study the collapse, they drew conclusions from it. As early as 1946, based on the survey results, a plan for the industrial disarmament of Germany was formed, known as the Morgenthau Plan, followed by its economically adapted version, the J. Kennan Plan, which provided for the dismantling of some enterprises and the country's transition to a peacetime economy. However, it soon became clear that it was more beneficial for Europe not to destroy German industry, but to restore it under control, making it the pillar of future economic equilibrium. Thus, the Marshall Plan emerged. Post-war German economists analyzing the experience of the war particularly highlighted the role of organizational structure. One of the first works on this topic, Die Deutsche Wirtschaftsordnung, prepared by former employees of Speer's ministry under the leadership of Hans Koenig, showed that the key factor in defeat was fragmentation of decision-making. In the Reich system, there were over 400 bodies involved in the war economy, from the departments of Reich ministers to regional Gau administrations. Each strove to assert its own priorities, and Hitler's supreme authority, which was supposed to coordinate, only amplified the chaos by making decisions situationally. Studies by German economists in the 1950s, particularly the works of Wilhelm Abel and Otto Kerner, were the first to thoroughly analyze wartime production figures. They showed that the growth of 1942-1943, which Speer liked to talk about, was a statistical mirage. This growth was explained not by a real increase in capacity, but by the accounting of stockpiles previously not included in reporting, and a temporary increase in the utilization of old machinery. By the autumn of 1943, industry had effectively reached its ceiling. Further growth required new machine tools and raw materials, which were no longer available. The problem of production sustainability, identified in the Reich, became the subject of serious academic discussions beyond Germany.
American economists, including John Kenneth Galbraith, who participated in a research commission, noted that the German economy died from an excess of centralized control and a lack of flexibility. He wrote, "In a planned system, it was possible to quickly produce weapons of one type, but it was impossible to retool when weapon types became obsolete." This explained why Germany produced thousands of Panther and Tiger tanks, but could not transition to the mass production of simpler and cheaper machines, like the Soviet T-34. Germany's recovery in the 1950s, the so-called economic miracle, was partly made possible precisely because post-war reforms eliminated the mistakes of the war economy. Ludwig Erhard's plan dismantled bureaucratic barriers, introduced market mechanisms for distribution, and ensured production standardization. In essence, German industry was reborn from the ashes of the Reich, learning lessons from its defeat. Industry reports from the late 1950s stated directly, "The strength of the German economy lies not in concentration, but in the free coordination of industries." Thus, Germany's defeat in the factories was not only the result of the war, but also a lesson for the future. It showed that industrial power is not just the number of machines and factories, but also the system's ability to adapt, maintain coordination, and remain resilient under pressure. Germany in the 1930s was able to create a grandiose war machine, but failed to build an economy that could bear its weight. This imbalance doomed the Third Reich to defeat long before the fronts collapsed.
German industry from 1942 to 1944 is not just tables and charts. It is a living organism, the giant heart of war, beating ever faster until the blood of resources and fuel ran dry. Every morning on the outskirts of the Ruhr began the same way. Thick smoke over blast furnaces, the creak of trolleys, the clang of hammers. On the workshop walls hung Goebbels' slogans, "Total war demands total work." Workers, smeared with soot, swallowed thin barley gruel and went to their machines, where metal was transformed into weapons and fatigue into duty. The spring of 1942 became a turning point. After Tote's death and Albert Speer's arrival, everything in production was attempted to be subjected to mathematics. From the chaos of departments, a system began to be born, Speer's statistic. Thousands of reports flowed into Berlin monthly. How many tanks, aircraft, shells, tons of steel, liters of fuel were produced. On the minister's desk lay neat graphs, their lines rising as if promising victory. In June 1942, Germany produced 3,400 aircraft. By June 1943, already 7,700, and a year later, over 13,000. On paper, the war looked like a triumph of rational economics. But if you look beneath these figures, another landscape is visible. The numbers did not mean the planes were taking off. They meant that parts had been produced somewhere, that fuselages without engines lay in warehouses, that workers from Ukraine assembled instruments without knowing their purpose. By the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe had over 5,000 aircraft in reserve, but lacked pilots, fuel, and most importantly, spare parts. Archival reports from the Ministry of Aviation, Reichsluftfahrtministerium, preserved lines. Of the 1,686 fighter group aircraft in service, 483 were combat ineffective. This was the disconnect between the numbers and reality. The same was happening in tank production. In 1942, MAN and Daimler-Benz factories began producing new models. The engineers were proud. Armor up to 100 millimeters thick, a gun range of 2,000 meters, and phenomenal shot accuracy. But behind the perfection lay a monstrous cost. One Tiger tank cost as much as 4 Soviet T-34s. It took almost a month to assemble. To deliver it to the front required reinforced platforms, repair columns, and fuel trucks. Reports from the Heereswaffenamt Army Weapons Office for March 1943 stated, of the 276 machines ready for shipment, 83 stand at the factory without gearboxes. And all this amidst a growing fuel shortage. Speer wrote in his diaries, "I drove the factories like whipped horses. We were producing more than ever, but the war was already slipping out of control. Transport was collapsing. Coal wasn't arriving. Wagons were stuck in tunnels. Any delay, and the numbers lost their meaning." He wasn't exaggerating. Archival documents from the Reichsbank show that by the end of 1943, the transportation system was operating at 60% of its design capacity. Every train carrying ammunition slowed down another, leading to disruptions in raw material supplies. According to Speer's statistic, in November 1943, factories stood idle for 1.8 million hours. This was lost solely due to the untimely delivery of coal and ore. Whilst Allied intelligence observed all of this with cold analytical precision. From the spring of 1943, Operation Point Blank began, strategic bombing of industry. First, they hit aircraft factories, then transport hubs, then oil refineries. In the summer of 1944, Americans and Britons dropped up to 100,000 tons of bombs on Germany monthly. From the air, it looked as if the entire country had turned into a vast, smoking workshop. According to post-war commission estimates, 69 out of the 75 largest enterprises in the Reich were rendered inoperable by March 1945. A report from the British Air Ministry in September 1944 provides precise figures. After the destruction of Leuna and Blechhammer, synthetic fuel production dropped from 170,000 tons per month to 20,000 tons per month. This meant that out of the 10 tons of gasoline needed for the front, Germany could only provide 1. Tanks stopped, planes didn't take off, and trucks stood still. Sappers merged into infantry, and tanks turned into immobile batteries. But even under the bombing, industry didn't surrender immediately. Photographs from the underground workshops of Mittelwerk, where V-2 rockets were assembled, resemble a nightmare. Thousands of people, prisoners and POWs, working in darkness amidst concrete and smoke. In these photographs, taken by the Americans in 1945, the partially disassembled rocket bodies are visible, as if the metal itself had frozen in anticipation of the end. According to camp administration reports, for every finished V-2, up to 5 workers had died. Speer recalled that in the final months of the war, he felt less like a minister and more like a chronicler of disaster. We were assembling weapons that no longer had a purpose. There was no fuel, the rails were broken, and silence reigned in the factories. Even the fans weren't working. The air in the workshops was stagnant, like in a tomb. And indeed, in the spring of 1945, Germany's industrial life came to an abrupt halt. Of the 11 million workers, only half remained at their posts. Power plants were not operating, coal was not being mined, steel was not being smelted. In documents found by the Allies in the underground storage of the Reich Ministry, the last entry is dated April 10, 1945. Production has ceased everywhere. When the Americans entered the Ruhr, they found vast, empty factory shells. On the floors lay the debris of presses, twisted beams, rusty machines, and traces of people who had hastily abandoned their workplaces. But somewhere signs with slogans still stood. Arbeit für den Sieg, work for victory. These words, printed on the walls, sounded like an echo of lost faith. The spring of 1945 marked the end not only of the military, but also of the industrial Germany of the Third Reich. The machines fell silent. The the smoke dissipated, and amidst the ruins it became clear defeat was born not in the trenches, but here, among the twisted iron, the undersmelted ingots, and the empty boilers. The factories, once a symbol of strength, became a symbol of collapse. They reflected the main lesson of the 20th century. War is won not by he who builds more guns, but by he who can maintain a balance between power and resilience. Spring 1945. Germany lay in ashes. From Kiel to Munich, from Essen to Dresden, smoke still rose above the ruined factories. Where hammers had recently thundered and press shops had hummed, silence reigned, broken only by the footsteps of Allied patrols and the tinkling of glass falling from twisted roofs. People returned to the factories as if to the ruins of their own bodies, and found emptiness where machines had once stood. On the walls where victory slogans had hung, soot marks and pale silhouettes of once removed portraits were now visible. Frida Klein, a factory worker in Essen, wrote in her diary on May 12, 1945, "I came to the factory. It was dead. We found a part of the shop intact, but without light, without power. Tools, sheets of metal lay on the floor. We sat on the cold slabs and were silent. No one knew where to begin. Only one old man said, 'Now we will build not weapons, but houses.' We cried." Such entries are preserved in many archives and private collections. They document the moment when a new country began to be born from the ruins of the war machine. The Allies, arriving in a devastated Germany, did not immediately grasp the scale of what was happening. Soldiers photographing factory ruins sometimes wrote on the back of the pictures, "This is not just the defeat of an army, it is the defeat of iron." American and British economic specialists, arriving in the summer of 1945, began a systematic survey. They not only compiled tables and reports, but also walked through the ruins, documenting every machine, every boiler, every burnt blueprint. The report of the commission, led by Major General William Draper, U.S. Economic Survey, September 1945, stated, "Germany lost not only its means of production, but also its very culture of labor. The engineering school, built on precision and pride, turned to dust. Restoration is only possible through the return of respect for creation." In places where entire workshops still remained intact, the first work began. Women who were called Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, carried bricks, cleared debris, and cleaned rust off machinery. In Bochum, Düsseldorf, and Wuppertal, they worked 12 hours a day, often without tools. American photographs from those years show women in headscarves standing amidst ruins, with infants in their arms and the skeletal remains of a blast furnace behind them. Initially, the Allies viewed the Ruhr as a source of danger. In London and Washington, the Morgenthau Plan was discussed, the idea of turning Germany into an agrarian country without heavy industry. But by 1947 it became clear that Europe could not be rebuilt without the revival of factories. New formulations began to appear in American reports. Germany's strength should be the foundation of peace, not a threat. From this, the Marshall Plan was born. In the spring of 1948, American ships began to arrive in Hamburg, the Ruhr, and Stuttgart, carrying equipment, food, generators, diesel engines, and metal. At the stations, crates marked ERP, European Recovery Program, were unloaded. People who had recently stood in line for rations now returned to work. Factories like Krupp, Siemens, Bosch, and Daimler-Benz were being revived. Engineers who had survived the war retrieved blueprints from safes, many of which had not yet gathered dust. Machines scorched by bombs were started up again, and for the first time in years, war gave way to the silence of labor. This was the beginning of the economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder. Ludwig Erhard, appointed director of economics, wrote, "We understood that the mistakes of the Reich could not be repeated. Industry should not be a weapon, it should be the foundation of freedom. Every machine that builds rather than destroys is an act of peace." It was from the ashes of war factories that a new Germany arose. They built factories where Volkswagens rolled off the assembly line instead of tanks, and printing presses where parts for radios and cars were produced instead of shells. For a long time, these places still smelled of burning and coal, but beneath that smell, a different energy was growing, the energy of creation. Archives created after the war preserved not only reports, but also the voices of people for whom war was not just statistics. Engineer Karl Dietrich, who worked at an aircraft factory in Augsburg, Germany, recalled, "When 1945 arrived, I could no longer look at metal. We forged death. After the war, I returned to my drawings and invented a part for an agricultural machine. That's when I first felt like a human being again." Such confessions were heard in every corner of a devastated Germany. From these voices, a new morality grew. Responsibility for technology, for labor, for the very idea of production. And therefore, when German factories breathed again in the 1950s, their rhythm was different. It lacked a marching beat, possessing instead the steady, measured pulse of work. From the perspective of historical science, by the mid-1950s, Germany had completed its turn from a war economy to a recovery economy. But yet, if one looks deeper, the defeat of 1945 left a mark on its heart that did not disappear. It served as a reminder that strength without resilience is doomed, that any system built on fear and command will sooner or later collapse. This thought runs like a red thread through the diaries, reports, and memories of people who lived through that era. It echoes in every old factory bell, which today rings not for a shift change, but for remembrance of a time when factories lost the war.